A decade and a half ago, Richard Florida introduced us to the influential idea of a creative class, which he saw as a driving force revitalizing and reshaping cities. In the intervening years, the economic geography of cities across North America has certainly changed, but as he argues in his new book, it hasn't all been positive. The book is called The New Urban Crisis: How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation, and Failing the Middle Class, and What We Can Do About It. And it brings Richard Florida back to our studio tonight. Hi. I must confess, this is not the follow-up to the last book that I thought we were going to read. Things are just very, very dark and gloomy here. Richard, before we get into the new urban crisis, let's just, for background purposes, establish what was the old urban crisis?
Well, it's very interesting. You know, I say in the book, I was born in 1957, a whole long time ago. And as a kid, I witnessed it. You know, I'm from Newark, New Jersey originally. And I tell the story of my dad. He wanted me both to go to a factory worker, wanted me both to go to my guitar lesson and to go to the Newark Public Library. And on a Saturday in July, he was driving us through Newark to the library and to my guitar lesson, and shots rang out.
He told you to hit the deck in the car.
Yeah, he said, get down. It was a Chevy, an old late 1950s or early 1960s Chevy Bel Air or Impala. And I got down on the floor, and you could see tanks, armored police vehicles and tanks, National Guards people. And I think I saw in that instant the old urban crisis, which later I had come to understand was really the flight of jobs, the flight of industry. My father's factory, where he worked, Victory Optical in the iron-bound industrial section of Newark, closed down. The department stores that we used to go to as a kid, great American department stores, Bamberger's, Hanes, Kresge's, they shuttered. Newark became emptied of its middle class, emptied of its jobs, emptied of its industry. And when I was graduating high school, literally that year, New York City, the city that I would walk, you know, up in our hometown, we'd moved to a suburb in North Arlington that overlooked New York City. New York City declared bankruptcy. So that was the old urban crisis, a crisis of really economic dysfunction and economic decay.
Fortunately for you, you have lived long enough to see many of those American cities come back, including one that you had a great relationship with, Pittsburgh. It is back. It is beautiful. You have been in Toronto now for, is it a decade almost?
Exactly a decade.
A decade in Toronto, and this is, if you don't mind my saying, I think one of the great cities in the world. However, for this book, you have had to revisit some of your old assumptions, and you write, I found myself confronting the dark side of the urban revival I had once championed and celebrated. How so?
Well, you know, the rise of the creative class really was a product of my seeing as a graduate student, I went to Columbia University, seeing the revival of New York City in the 80s. With musicians and artists and designers and people all in punks and hippies and bohemians in the Soho area in the Greenwich Village. And then I moved to Pittsburgh and I saw this fabulous university called Carnegie Mellon. I recently saw it was ranked like the third top place where Google recruits its people from. Kind of like our own Waterloo, but you know, even probably bigger. And it had all of these great software developers and computer scientists, and faculty members were going to run laboratories at Apple and Google. My students, though, weren't staying in Pitt. Quite a contrast to my students at the Rotman School, who literally all want to stay in Toronto. These young people wanted to go to San Francisco or New York or Boston. And really, my book about the creative class was about how cities could try to position themselves to attract these people. But in the intervening 15 years, I think things have changed a lot.
Given the way it's turned out then, do you think you were wrong about the way you positioned it before?
No, I think I was absolutely right. In fact, people ask me this. I think I underpredicted the urban revival. That's what I would say I was wrong about. I was so hopefully optimistic that cities like Pittsburgh or Detroit or Cleveland would come back. You know, think about Toronto 2 decades ago. It was a good city. But it wasn't this kind of massive urban revival with skyrocketing housing prices and a dividing. It was a different town. So I think I underpredicted the urban revival. And I think I was quite shocked at how fast it came on, how big it was, and many of the challenges and divisions it brought with us. And so that's where I began to retrospect and introspect and say, oh my God, this urban revival that I was kind of rosy-eyed about, that I was very optimistic about, Yes, it brought many good things. It helped many cities came back. It brought talented people, and it brought back many declining neighborhoods. But it was creating a new set of problems that I had not anticipated and that I knew I needed to dig into and try to figure out.
So how influential was actually living in Toronto over the past decade to your new way of looking at things?
You know, it's really interesting. I never thought of it until writing this book. If my original desire to be an urbanist was shaped by my experience in Newark, New Jersey, and then going to graduate school in New York City and seeing urban decline turn to urban revival. The death and life of great American cities, to quote great Jane Jacobs.
Yep.
If the rise of the creative class was really shaped by my experience in Pittsburgh, a spectacular industrial city that was creating technology and talent, but seeing it move away, this book is a product of Toronto. And, you know, I moved here, the naive, and you remember because we met very, very, very early on, and you were gracious enough to have me on your show back then. I was so excited to come to Jane Jacobs, Toronto, the city I studied, the bastion of progressive urbanism. New York run by the Swiss. You know all these cliches. The city that still Americans believe does it right. We have our own, we know our warts, but Americans kind of, especially American urbanists, put Toronto on a pedestal. And then, of course, I was talking to Mayor Miller, Councillor Ray. We were talking about how to make Toronto a more inclusive economy, a more inclusive, innovative system. And into the void comes Rob Ford. Well, it really was the Ford election that was my big wake-up call.
That speaks to the next quote I want to put forward here, because here you are in the book saying all three, Donald Trump, Rob Ford, and the Brexit referendum, reflect the deepening fault lines of class and location that define us and divide us today. They are the product of our new age of winner-take-all urbanism, in which the talented and the advantaged cluster and colonize a small select group of superstar cities, leaving everybody and everywhere else behind. Much more than a crisis of cities, the new urban crisis is the central crisis of our time. Let's elaborate on that. Trump, Ford, Brexit. The product of this urban crisis? How so?
I remember when Rob Ford got elected, I wrote, not only was he, to my mind, an anti-urban mayor, but if he could get elected in Toronto, more and worse would follow. And by the way, Ford was a very benign kind of populism. He had his own personal problems, but he wasn't a bad, evil person. And he had a multi-ethnic, multicultural coalition, Asian, immigrant, new Canadian, Caribbean, and white working class. Yep. I think what followed, you know, and then I said, well, Brexit, okay, I understand that. America will never elect Trump. And when Trump was elected, I literally rewrote this book from top to bottom. But I think they really reflect one dimension of the new urban crisis, which is this increasing geographic divide. You know, lots of very smart people have talked about economic inequality and income inequality. This book is about geographic inequality or spatial inequality. You know, it's bad in Canada. You know, Toronto is much more economically advantaged than Hamilton or Windsor. But in the United States, the level of geographic inequality from these, what I call the superstar cities, you know, like New York City, or the knowledge hubs like San Francisco or DC, compare them not just to Detroit and Cleveland and my own Pittsburgh, but then compare them to Dayton and Akron and these faltering towns all throughout the country. I have a chart that exemplifies winner-take-all urbanism in the book. How many houses can you buy for the price of one apartment in Soho? I don't know exactly what it is, but it's something like 38 houses in Memphis, 50 houses in parts of Detroit, 100 houses in parts of Youngstown. So this divide between, and so what happened, the same thing which happened with Ford here. There was this reaction against the so-called urban elites, the so-called urban cosmopolitans. People were falling further and further behind, and this backlash of populism filled the void.
Your book is actually replete with charts, and we want to share some of them with our viewers right now, because here's a couple of them. You talk about the superstar cities, and I want to advance a different kind of point here rather than the one you just made. Sheldon, let's show this. Okay, we got this. This is the share of Canada's economic output by city. So you see Toronto, number one there, of course, big economic engine, almost 20%. Montreal, almost 10. Vancouver, almost 7. Calgary, a little over 6. Edmonton, a little over 5. But you add up those top 5 cities, that's almost half the economic output of the entire country in those 5 cities. Let's compare that to the United States. You've got New York City, the number one city, but well below 10%. LA, just over 5. Chicago, just over 3.5. Houston, not quite 3. Washington, D.C., not quite 3. So the top 5 only represent a quarter of the economic output of the United States. So my question is, why is the concentration of all of that economic output in our 5 main cities and representing so much more a part of our economy, why is that concerning to you?
Well, I think Canada is actually more near the norm, and the U.S. is an outlier. You know, U.S. came out of World War II a hegemonic power. It really dominated the world. It could have this massive suburbanization. I remember when I met Jane Jacobs, you know, we were sitting in her house in the annex, and she said something. She said, you know, Canada has, in Jane's way, you know, 3, maybe 5 significant cities. She wasn't trying to be mean to Canada, but she was sort of saying, the U.S., Richard, there are all these second and third tier cities, and it's just a bigger place. And there's Austin, and there's Nashville, and there's all of these different kinds of places. And Canada is more normal. And I actually have a chart somewhere at the Martin Prosperity Institute or at the blog at where I write at City Lab, which compared countries by share of economic output in their major metros. The U.S. is very low. Canada is in the middle, about normal. In Korea, South Korea, Seoul, one metro produces more than 50% of all economic output. And really the book is about this Janus phase, two-headed force called the clustering force. You know, just following Jane Jacobs' lead, it's not just great companies or great research and development units or great laboratories or great startup companies or tech companies that drive economic growth. It's not just the accumulation of talent and highly educated people. It's the clustering of all of that in great cities. Yeah. Talent and people and diversity and information and knowledge and universities and companies. And so that drives economic growth. So it makes sense that people cluster in Toronto and Vancouver or San Francisco. The downside of that, of course, is that very same clustering force, the flip side, the dark side, is that it carves the divides both between metropolitan areas and within them that really stand at the heart of the new urban crisis.
So if those super cities are the winners, who are the losers?
Well, I think the losers are the places that are falling further and further behind as their kids, you know, from across Canada move to Toronto or maybe Vancouver, as their kids move to New York. And you see that less here because Canada still has, you know, we have but we have some level of social cohesion. We have health care. We have good schools in the urban core, in contrast to the United States. You see it more in the United States because people are incredibly anxious. You know, those former working class towns, those old rural areas in the Midwest, especially the places that swung for Trump. People are scared to death that they're being left behind. And you know, I've studied this in great detail. It's not so much the economic anxiety directly. It really is what they consider to be an assault on their values. Now, I don't agree with this. I'm an urbanite. I believe in diversity and openness and all the things I believe that Toronto or other great cities stand for. But many people who are being left behind, who couldn't move, don't want to move, feel like there's an assault on family values, that these new urban values are not the traditional values that they grew up with. That's not just in the United States. That's not just in Canada. You see that all throughout Europe. So that's the divide we're facing as these superstar cities and knowledge clusters, tech hubs, attract people, develop these robust economies, become very innovative. The rest of these countries, the rest of the heartland, get angrier and angrier, not only at their economic success, only partly at their economic success, even more so at the values that they espouse.
Let's pursue this notion of kind of superstar cities as almost private clubs in a way. Sheldon, bring up this next graphic, if you will. Here's the highest housing prices worldwide. And I mean, look where Vancouver's number 3 on this list. Toronto is number 7 on this list. We talk about median house price to median household income, and you see the multiplier effect right there. Even Montreal comes in at number 11 on this list. The suggestion, I guess, here being that certain cities are becoming, you know, in some respects, a luxury that only the richest people can afford to live in. Is that the way it looks to you?
Well, we're living it here. We're living it here in Toronto. And I think that was really striking to me when we came across these data, which is quite bright because you can compare cities across the world. When you look at the median housing price in that city, in that currency, compared to the median income. Now, of course, a flat in London costs way more than a flat in Toronto and even Vancouver. A townhouse in New York, you know, it's 10, 20, $50 million. Who knows if or more. But the incomes are higher.
Yeah.
You know, Vancouver's incomes are lower. And in fact, people now are saying, well, where is this money coming from? Because the incomes in Vancouver can't support them. So as you said, Vancouver is on this basis the third most, I think it's only Hong Kong and Sydney are more expensive.
Yep.
Toronto's 9th, and I think as expensive or more expensive than metropolitan New York. Not downtown Manhattan, but metropolitan New York.
Toronto's 7, actually. Toronto's number 7, Montreal at number 11.
Yeah, it's terrifying. And in this report, they talk about how Canada is one of the most unaffordable places in the world. I don't have the exact statistics at my fingertips, but many of our small and medium-sized communities, metros, compared to their peers, are also quite unaffordable. So I think it means that we are trying, well, we know this. You know, the rule of thumb is what? 80% of our population lives in 2% of our land area. We're a very urban country because we have to generate economic growth and productivity. We've packed our population in these cities. Plus, add to this, one of the greatest things about Canada, they accepted a person like me. I'm a new Canadian. My kids are Canadian citizens. They've accepted, 50% of our population in Toronto came from another country. We've been very accepting of refugees, Syrian refugees. So add that pressure, you take the domestic migration to these hubs and superstar cities, add the international migration, and we put a lot of pressure on our housing market. Now, we build a lot. We have a lot of cranes in the sky. And to Americans, it's really an envy to American urbanists. Wow, look at those 100 and some cranes in the sky in Toronto. But somehow, as much as we build, we can't keep up.
Well, that is true because we've got 150,000 more people coming here every year. So I guess let's look into some of that. We want to try to figure out why prices are so high. NIMBYism, what role does that play? Not in my backyard. Don't build that in my backyard. What role does that play in the high cost of housing here?
Well, at the risk of getting myself killed by my fellow urbanite peers in Toronto, I felt this, and I talk about this in the book. I wrote a kind of thought experiment in one of our papers saying, look, I understand all the debate about the island airport, but what if we were to consider jets? Not saying make jets go in the airport. What if we were to consider that and balance? Take the cost to our quality of life against the added value of connection. And there is a research literature that shows having two great airports like LaGuardia and JFK, well, actually three, JFK and Newark, is additive. Well, my God, people thought I was heretical.
They'll throw you out of the club for that one.
I was almost, I redeemed myself. Now, I had done enough good that I was allowed back in the club. But the point in this book, I think, and that's an extreme example, but we have a lot of NIMBY behavior. That's called the not in my backyard syndrome. And what people do is if they have a good quality of life, right? If I live in a lovely neighborhood with single-family homes or low-rise buildings, I don't want a new high-rise tower because it's going to ruin my neighborhood character. It's a big thing about neighborhood character. Well, in the book, I say that's not only NIMBYism, and it may be well-intentioned. If the source of economic productivity, of innovation, of economic growth, of job generation is strong, clustered, dense, affordable cities, holding back the housing development we need through NIMBY behavior, onerous old-school land use restriction building codes, I call them the new urban Luddites. People like this term because, like the Luddites, were very concerned that the new factories and machines would cost them their jobs in England and smash the machines. In a way, NIMBY behavior kind of destroys the clustering or limits the clustering we need to scale our cities and become more innovative. According to one study in the US, now these are heuristic numbers and big estimates, but that the land use restrictions in place in the US in places like Boston and New York and San Francisco cost the United States economy about 9% of GDP a year, something like $1.5 to $2 trillion in lost economic output per year. So it's something that we need to think about. Now, again, in Toronto, we are doing a lot to build, and we're revamping our building and zoning codes, but we could do more.
Here's David Byrne, the musician, writing a few years ago, "If the 1% stifles New York's creative talent, I'm out of here. Most of Manhattan and many parts of Brooklyn are virtual walled communities, pleasure domes for the rich. Middle-class people can barely afford to live here anymore, so forget about emerging artists, musicians, actors, dancers, writers, journalists, and small business people. Bit by bit, the resources that keep the city vibrant are being eliminated." Is David right?
Well, first of all, the Talking Heads were my favorite band. So, they were a band that came on when I was in college and really, to me, typified not only a new sound, but when I was exploring those neighborhoods of Soho and the Village and Tribeca, they were the it group. So I adore David Byrne. I'm of two minds on this. Clearly, I'm a New Yorker. I spend a lot of time in New York. I have a visiting fellowship at NYU. It's a different city. And now, again, I'm a Manhattanite, especially since I grew up in New Jersey. I don't know the outer boroughs as well, but you don't feel the energy. I mean, Soho does sometimes feel like a luxury mall. Never mind, I don't go near Trump Tower for a whole bunch of reasons, but never mind the area near Central Park or the Upper East Side, which are really colonized by the global super rich. That said, according to the data in this book, when we really looked hard at how creative New York is, how much music, fashion, design, writing, it may be a neighborhood effect. It may be parts of Manhattan have been squashed out a little. Maybe it's migrated to Brooklyn or the Bronx. It is to Queens, where younger people are going. You can't yet find a discernible, a diminution of creative energy And of course, as I point out in the book, New York City has seen a massive increase in tech startups. But I worry now, if this continues for an extended length of time, and one other thing I point out in the book, and it's so funny, as a kid who grew up on the East Coast, I don't want to say I was anti-LA, but I always thought of LA as the example of sprawl and spread out. LA has actually been attracting members of the creative, innovative class from New York. And actually, the more you talk to New Yorkers, and they're saying, well, LA, housing is more affordable. We've seen a migration of artists to big loft buildings in downtown LA. So it's very interesting. I think Byrne, he may be a little bit overstating it, but I think he has his finger on a troubling trend.
How about gentrification? What role does it play in this crisis that you've described?
Well, I have a whole chapter in the book on gentrification. It is an emotionally charged issue. And one of the things I say in the book is, I can't empty it of its emotional charge, but at least I can try to be objective. And many of us feel guilty when we move to an urban neighborhood and we move in and people get displaced. Here's what we know. First of all, gentrification up until very recently has been something that only a relatively small number of cities have seen in great mass. London, of course, where Ruth Glass, a contemporary of Jane Jacobs, invented the term in the early 1960s. London, of course, New York and Lower Manhattan, Boston around Beacon Hill and Back Bay, San Francisco, Philadelphia around Society Hill and Rittenhouse Square, Washington, D.C., and a few other places.
Well, the city you're in.
Toronto, but remember gentrification in Toronto. I remember coming and seeing the annex when it was gentrifying. Cabbage Town, but it wasn't pervasive. Don't get me wrong. Even in a superstar city, and I really do consider, by the way, I consider Toronto to be more of a mini superstar city. Its economy looks more to me like New York or London than Chicago. It really is a finance, entertainment, media, technology hub.
Right.
But according to the spectacular research of my colleague Nate Baum-Snow, who we recruited from Brown University, the University of Toronto, this Back to the City movement goes bonkers, goes berserk from the year 2000 to now. And that's when we see gentrification begin to hit small, like a Pittsburgh, a Detroit. Now, it's still not pervasive in those places. And one thing I talk about, there's so much focus on direct displacement. That's not the real effect. It's really as housing prices rise generally, people get pushed out. And so the statistic that I find most illuminating from an economist named Jed Kolko, it's the top 10% of income earners, the affluent and the educated, that have moved back to cities, and the bottom 10 of income earners that have been pushed out. But I think the biggest effect is not because gentrification, classic gentrification, outside of a few examples like Harlem or Bedford-Stuyvesant in New York, it takes place in old industrial zones, like the meatpacking district, like Chelsea, or in white working class neighborhoods. The bigger and more distressing fact is that if you look at historically minority neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, especially in the United States, with those few exceptions that everyone can point to, they've remained untransformed, they've remained poor, and in fact, concentrated racial poverty has grown. It's a complicated issue, but I think I want to put the focus where the focus needs to be. Gentrification is important, but the fact that we're dividing is even more important.
Well, let's pick up on that. Rising inequality. And to do this, we want to take a look at some numbers on inequality in Canadian cities and do some comparisons here. So Sheldon, let's bring this up if we can. According to a report by the Martin Prosperity Institute, the level of income inequality, let's start on the West Coast. There's Vancouver. In 2013, as measured by what's known as the Gini coefficient, was 0.42, which is the same as Russia. In Calgary, it was 0.43, which is the same level of inequality as El Salvador. Here in the Big Smoke, 0.40, same as in Turkey. Montreal, a notch lower at 0.39, the same as in Thailand. Finally, let's go to the other coast. Halifax, 0.38, which is just slightly worse than Iran at 0.37. How has the middle class fared in Canada's biggest three cities? Again, let's check. In 1970, 66% of the population of Toronto was middle class. In 2005, it was just 29%. In 1970 in Vancouver, it was 71%. By 2005, the middle class had shrunk to 53%. And finally, Montreal, 1970 in Montreal, 64% of the people were middle class. By 2005, that had shrunk to 55%. It looks like the success of super cities inevitably leads to increased inequality. That can't be good.
You said it at the outside, it's the basic contradiction of contemporary, what I call urbanized knowledge capitalism. It is clustered urbanized capitalism. But one thing I want to point out those statistics are from my brilliant colleagues at the University of Toronto that we pulled together in that report. The Gini coefficient data is from a spectacular scholar named Alan Walks, who's a leading scholar of both urban and suburban trends. And of course, the statistics on the declining middle are the work of, I think, the person who's influenced me most after Jane Jacobs, David Holchansky.
Holchansky from Toronto.
My colleague David Holchansky really gave me the lens, all of us the lens, to understand the Ford phenomena, which is, if the old urban crisis was the flight of the middle class to the suburbs, the new urban crisis is the evisceration of the middle, of these middle class neighborhoods. And those are his numbers. I mean, those numbers and his colleagues are the ones who did the Montreal numbers and the Vancouver number, not our research. But those numbers from Toronto are shocking and terrifying. And remember, those numbers you showed are for 2005 because we didn't have a census.
Right.
Can you imagine when these are updated to the year 2015 or 2016? Because that's when the reurbanization hits. Those numbers are going to go down. It's going to get much worse.
It's going to get worse, yeah.
So it really is that hole in the middle. And to your point, in my work, I was able to do a little bit more statistical analysis with my team at the University of Toronto. Where has the middle class declined the most? The largest, the most technologically sophisticated, the most creative class, the most highly educated cities. Where has income inequality risen the most? Again, this is the research of my colleague Nate Bounce-Snow. So we have quite a cluster of great urbanists at the University of Toronto. What does he find? The larger the metropolitan area, the more talent, the more creative class, the higher inequality. So in my book, in the New Urban Crisis, I say, this crisis of inequality and segmentation, decline of the middle, is baked into the very geography of our superstar cities. And we have to realize that the same places that drive our growth also are contributing to, if not causing, our divides.
I don't want the clock to get too far away from us here before we start to consider some of the solutions that you think we need to put into place. So let's talk a bit about what we can do to reverse this trend, which, as you've described it, is becoming increasingly unequal, deepening segregation, failing the middle class. Here's where we get to and what we can do about it part of the interview. Increase density, make housing more affordable. Let's start there. What do you want to do on that front?
Well, we have to do two things. We have to overcome NIMBYism and the new urban Luddism. Now, a lot of people, really smart urban economists, have made this point, and we have to build more. But if we just build more, you see it in Toronto, you see it in Vancouver, you see it in New York. We end up building a lot of luxury towers for high net worth people where the lights are off. Now housing has become a commodity, a class of, I talk about this in the book, a class of asset to be traded like stocks and bonds and gold. So yes, we have to do that, but we also have to build more affordable. And and here I think that Canada has an advantage, because with Trump in the White House, the United States is not going to have a national urban strategy. But with Trudeau and with Premier Wynne and with Mayor Tory and other great, Mayor Nenshi, Mayor Robinson, I can go on, Canada has a shot at really developing a strategy. And you see the debate here. How can we get more money for social housing? A debate that's not happening in the United States. We need more affordable housing. In the old world, suburbs were our way to get that. Cheap, constructed, suburban little homes like my dad bought. We're going to have to invent an urban equivalent of that. So we're going to have to bring down housing costs, and we're going to have to subsidize and develop and there are many ways to do it. But Lord knows we're going to need more affordable housing for the working class, the service class, and the middle class in our urban cores.
You make the point in the book that one of Henry Ford's brightest ideas was making sure that he paid his workers enough that they could actually go buy the cars that they were making. And so I need to ask about the low-wage service work and whether or not people who make those low wages in these big cities can actually afford to continue to live in them.
Well, there were two parts to the old Canadian dream. One was an affordable house, again, affordable housing unit, in this case, in the suburbs with a mortgage. We have to create an analog of that for the new urban age in our downtowns and urban cores. The second part of it was a good job. Henry Ford and others decided that those manufacturing workers needed to be paid a decent wage. Before that, they were paid barely a subsistence wage. We had labor legislation. We gave workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. We created our own new deals and social safety nets in Canada, in the United States, of course, in Scandinavia and Northern Europe. And my dad, I talk about my dad's story. He said, Rich, when I started as a factory worker at age 13 in 1934 in Newark in an eyeglass factory, it took 9 of us, granddad, grandma, and the 6 kids, your 6 aunts and uncles, plus me, to make a family wage. I came back from my service in World War II as an infantry soldier, stormed the beaches at Normandy, Same factory. He didn't change factories. He said, as if by magic, then he told me the story, and it was the New Deal, and it was the unions. As if by magic, that same job that took 9 people, I could buy a home as one wage earner, I could get married, buy a home, have you 2 boys. He put us through Catholic, he thought parochial school was better. Catholic school, get you into public university, Rutgers College in New Jersey. And I was on the escalator. You know,
One salary.
one salary.
Amazing.
And the next thing I talk about in the book is, well, we need to upgrade those service jobs. So across Canada, across the United States, across the advanced world, about 20% of us still have a job like my dad. About 5% of people work in a factory. Lots more people work in construction or work in installation, maintenance, drive trucks. They have a good blue-collar job. They might make 45 grand. It's still not enough, but a third of us work in the knowledge jobs and the creative class jobs. And we're doing, even in the expensive cities, I have all the data in the book, we can still cut it. We might even make 80 or 90 or 100 grand, depending on where we live. 45% of us are working these low-wage, contingent, precarious, high turnover service jobs. Retail work, office work, food preparation and service work, home health care aid, taking care of older people, our aging parents, taking care of our children. Those people make 20 or 30,000 total, maybe working multiple jobs. Put their housing costs in there, they're left with 10 or 15 grand to live off of. It's like a developing country, this divide. So in the book, I say that one of our key things is that we have to turn that 45% of jobs into better jobs.
Does that mean a higher minimum wage?
Yes.
Does that mean okay, where do you want to put it at?
Well, I think it should be indexed to about 50 or 60% of the local median, or or judged on the cost of living. So it would be higher in Toronto than Hamilton than in Windsor, higher in New York or San Francisco than Buffalo or Cleveland, but it should reflect those cost of living or prevailing wage conditions. In an advanced city, about $15. But that's still not, that just creates a floor. The thing is, and Roger Martin, my colleague at the University in Toronto, business school dean, business school consultant, we've really been working on this. What we find, and what a group of researchers at MIT find, is just like when you paid manufacturing workers better, and you organize them in teams in the advanced factories, like we have in Ontario, they could engage in continuous improvement, lean manufacturing. They could form circles, contribute their innovations, contribute to productivity. Same thing works in a retail shop. Same thing works in a restaurant. Same thing works in the great hotels. We can go on. When workers are working in teams, when they're paid better, when they have when they can have an internal career ladder, they can engage their customers better, they can create more innovations, and they can drive productivity and profits up. So it can be, if done right, a win-win for the worker, for the company, and actually, if it improves service and makes hospitality better, for the city itself.
We got a minute left. I hate to hold you to a minute, because you can't be held to a minute, but we're going to try here anyway. Public transit infrastructure, another key part of the whole equation, yes?
Well, it's falling apart, even in our great cities. Look at New York, where it doesn't work. Look at here. In order to scale our cities, we not only need to build more affordable housing, we need to make sure that we grow not only in the core, but out. The way to connect those suburbs, and the way to bring Hamilton and Waterloo and all of this as part of us, is to build great transit and great high-speed infrastructure to allow us to scale and build a stronger, more affordable metropolis.
You did it.
I tried.
You did. You came in under a minute.
Thank you.
Richard, I want to thank you for coming and visiting us again here at TVO. You always give us so much to think about. The new urban crisis is your latest contribution to what you see out there. How our cities are increasing inequality, deepening segregation, and failing the middle class, and what we can do about it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario on behalf of its more than 85,000 members and 23,000 students.